Hello, class. Welcome back to part 2 of our medieval journey, going medieval. So last we were talking about music in the church and the nice medieval modes. Today, or I shouldn't say today, in part 2 here, we're going to transition into music outside of the church. Because even though the church reigns supreme and in the academic and really learned music, shall we say, that isn't to say that music didn't exist outside of the church and that the church was able to sequester music unto itself. Because, as you are probably well aware, today even, you experience music in many different places, okay? So there is the really high academic music, like today, if I were to equate it to something, it'd be like going to the symphony. You would equate going to the symphony as something really special or something very fancy, even though I hope to change your mind about that in this class. But that, especially in our region, that's kind of the idea that pops in our head that, oh, that's something fancy. Fancy people do that. We can argue those points later. But we still have music that we listen to at home and music that we listen to with our friends. Sadly, we don't do much in line of making music at home or making music with our friends anymore, which is a real pity. But that was the music outside of the church, the secular music. Okay? So the secular music of the medieval period is really interesting. There's a really interesting history of like performers and people that went around. And the two that we're going to focus a lot on are the troubadours and the trouviers. Those are French individuals. Troubadours coming from, I believe, the north of France, trouviers from the south of France. I may have those two inverted. I don't have the book in front of me, and I can never keep it straight. And I never ask you to keep it straight either. I just ask that you remember they're from France. Okay, so troubadours and trouviers, really interesting people. And we'll discuss why here in just a second. I believe. If not, I'll come back to the point. But the songs that they sung were based on poetry and followed very poetic forms. Okay, so if you study poetry, you know that there are poetic forms like ballades and such, varizo and things like that. I am not well equipped with a knowledge of poetry and various poetic forms, but I do know a few of them. These people, though, were very much in keeping with the courtly ideals, the very Arthurian code of chivalry type songs. So they're very, very much about virtues and love and being all knightly and those things. It's, we would kind of think it's a little bit pandering today. But that was, the type of music that people were generally doing outside of the church. And these were monophonic pieces as well, but they generally had some sort of accompaniment with them that you would use yourself. So it would be like picking your guitar like you sung, as you sung. Now, I argue with the fact that these are monophonic, and the only reason why I say they're monophonic is it's because most sources that you say will say that it's a monophonic texture. I'm not sure that you hear it as a monophonic texture, especially given the definition of monophonic that we learn. But it is definitely a single solo vocalist. You know what's important, but I would argue a different texture. But just stick with monophonic because that is what sources are going to tell you. And like I said, they focus on love and honor. Okay? So, this is a video that, of course, isn't going to play, but listen to it on your slideshow so that you can get an idea of what these pieces sound like. Now, what I don't have on here that I want to come back to about the troubadours and trouviers, these were not, I think sometimes we tend to think of troubadours, trouviers, or like any sort of performer during this period, I'm sorry for messing these slides up, as just kind of being lowly in status. Because for a time, musicians did serve more of a servant role. But actually, during this time, your musicians were all courtly people. So they would have been noble men and noble women, shockingly enough, that were performing. So don't get caught up in that these people aren't very important performers. They are extremely important performers. Okay? coming over here. The rise of polyphony. So, early medieval music was very monophonic, the Gregorians, but then around 900 we start getting people that are experimenting with sounds and saying, gee, I think we could do more than just sing a single melodic line. I doubt that's the actual narrative, but that's kind of how it plays out in my head. So what we first get is this thing called organum. And organum it sounds really weird because it's open fourths, open perfect fourths, and open perfect fifths. So they would take an existing melody, and then they would add pitches, either a perfect fourth or a perfect fifth above. So if you're not familiar with what a perfect fourth or a perfect fifth is, think back to when we talked about pitch in the pitches videos. But basically, if you're on C and you count up 5, including C, you would land on a G. So if you were to play C and G together, that would be what organum sounds like. And then you'd play D and A together, C and G, and you would want to keep playing perfect fifths, so there would sometimes be a black key you'd have to put in to make that work. But it creates this very atmospheric, otherworldly sound. You don't know if it's major, you don't know if it's minor. We're still not there yet. But it creates a lot more interest, and it would have been mind-blowing during this time to hear this happen. And of course, it's very sacred. And then that leaves the church and starts spilling out of the church, and we get conductus, which is like organum, but it's newly composed secular music. Okay? Then, by the end of the medieval period, we get this new art, the Ars Nova. We're not quite to the Renaissance, but it's like knocking on the Renaissance's door. And the music starts becoming more sophisticated, and we start getting people playing around with the idea of polyphonic writing, counterpoint. And we get this new little beast called the cantus firmus. Okay? And if you've taken theory with me, you're all familiar with cantus firmus writing. Okay? And cantus firmus writing and the methodologies that were born out of this innovation, we still use today, okay? And you may think, oh, I don't listen to anything like that. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to mock your voice there, but, you may be thinking that. But you do. Every song you listen to uses these basic principles that were constructed during this time, because it is where we learn how to write a good bass line that complements a melody. So every time that bass drops and you're like, yes, thank the people of the Ars Nova and Cantus Firmus for your bass drops. Okay? So some major composers, that slide's not going to work, but that's okay. Let's talk about Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard, amazing composer. Actually, you know what? We're going to save Hildegard for part 3. So I'm going to stop her here. I'm going to stop at major composer slide and leave you hanging, and we'll be back. All right? So look for part 3.